The history books are filled with colourful characters, and Eddie Chapman was definitely one of the brightest. He could be called many things: rogue, scoundrel, conman, cheerily unrepentant criminal, and even maybe secret agent. Desperate times call for desperate measures, the old saying goes, and the dark days of World War II were definitely desperate times. Had Chapman been living, working, and stealing at any other time in history, he may have found governments and military agencies, and those who regularly arrested him, to be much less lenient than they were. He wasn't the sort to be trusted with anything, yet British intelligence did trust him, and so did the Germans. And it's here that we use the word trusting rather loosely. One of the military intelligence agents who worked with Chapman was Lieutenant Colonel Robin Tin-Eye Stevens, and it's worth setting the scene with his thoughts on one of his most unpredictable agents. He wrote, "I do not wish to be held wanting in admiration of a brave man, but must issue a warning about this strange character. Where do the loyalties of Chapman lie? Personally, I think they are in fine balance." Desperate times indeed. Eddie Chapman was born in England on November 16th, 1914, and for the first decade or so of his life, he had little in the way of a male role model that he could look up to and learn from. His father, Ralph Edward, was a chief engineer on a tramp steamer, a merchant vessel that had no schedule and simply went wherever it needed in order to sell or deliver whatever cargo was loaded onto it. And that had to be difficult. The elder Chapman would be gone for up to 5 years at a time, making his young son the man of the house. During this time, the family lived in Sunderland. It was an area defined by the shipyards and the sea, and Chapman grew up surrounded by the hustle and bustle of shipyards scrambling to keep up with the demands made on them by World War I. By all accounts, Chapman, the oldest of 3 siblings, was well loved by his brother and sister. It's a bit of an unconventional start to our tale because family life wasn't too bad. But that was only to start with. Although his father had hoped to see his oldest child follow in his footsteps, Chapman had little mechanical aptitude and even less interest in school. As fate would have it, this didn't really matter though. By the time Chapman was a young teenager, World War I was over. Soldiers were returning to the lives that they had left behind as best they could, and that meant there were a lot of people looking for work. A recession gripped the country, unemployment skyrocketed, and by 1930, 19 of the area's shipyards had closed. The industry that had been so vital to the country and to the war effort just years before was floundering, and Chapman's father was forced to find other work. He took on work at a pub where his son helped him serve dock workers, sailors, and fishermen. In other words, a pretty rough crowd. The family still found it nearly impossible to make ends meet, so young Chapman dropped out of school at just 14 years old. His intentions were good. He was going to help support his family, but times were tough and he was only able to find work for a handful of days every month. What jobs he could find were hard work for little pay, and in his older years, Chapman would speak of the slums of his native Sunderland and say they were far worse than I had seen anywhere else in Europe. He also added his most lively memories of childhood had been of the cold misery of the dole. In order to claim any benefits, Chapman was instructed to attend a school where he would learn skills that would make him more employable. That was the goal at least, and in hindsight, that's kind of what happened. He was taught things like working with metal, but it was hardly productive. It's no wonder that he started skipping classes, and when he realized his parents had found out about his absences, he decided to go on something of a walkabout. He tried to go to London, he tried to find work, but neither of those things panned out. He returned home, and it ended up being a surprisingly important episode in his life. He'd gotten a taste of the adventure that was out there, and it made a lasting impact on him. This is also when a small but significant event took place, one that would show that the lifelong duality of Chapman's personality and motivations went back to when he was a teenager. It was one Sunday when he and his brother skipped out on going to church, a major transgression with their mother. They headed to the beach, and that's where Chapman heard a call for help. A man was drowning 50 yards out into the water. Chapman took off down the beach, dove into the water, and saved the man's life. He never told anyone about it, at least not until he was honoured with a certificate from the Royal Humane Society. He didn't want his mother to know that he'd skipped church, even though he had done something amazing with his day. It embodied an idea that will continue throughout this tale. He may do some not-so-honourable things. He may have been a scamp and a scallywag, out only for himself, but at the end of the day, he did save lives. In spite of all the hardships, Chapman still had good intentions. He joined the Coldstream Guards when he was just 17 years old with the help of a falsified birthday and a talent for forging his father's signature. And he excelled at this. In spite of a serious knee injury, he ultimately found himself wearing a guard's uniform, and he was quite literally tasked with guarding England's crown jewels at the Tower of London. He'd come a long way, but the old Chapman, the boy who'd seen the slums, witnessed the struggles of the unemployed and the starving, who had collected bottles on the beach to turn in for just a bit of cash to help his struggling family, that boy was still in there. And in 1933, he saw something that would change his life again: the death of his mother. He was in the Guards when he got the letter, and he immediately went to the tuberculosis ward of a local hospital for the poor. He made it to her side before she died, and she did manage to tell him how proud she was of him and how respectable he looked in his uniform. But he saw something quite different that day: a wonderful woman who had given her all for her family and who had died in a hospital for the poor. And while it doesn't seem to have changed who he was, it does seem to have been a trigger that changed the path he was on. After his mother's death, he was given leave from the Guards. He headed to London, and that was where he promptly went AWOL. Predictably, Chapman was arrested and sent to the stockade before being dishonorably discharged. From there, it was off to Soho, and an entirely different world. Throughout the 1930s, Chapman was flexing his muscles in the seedy underbelly of London's Soho district. He did everything and anything. He danced, he wrestled, he forged checks, and he was always on the lookout for the chance to nick something. After getting in good with the shady characters who frequented a bar called Smoky Joe's, he escalated into breaking and entering. It wasn't long before he got the attention of a group of enemies called the Jelly Gang, who took their name from the highly explosive materials they used to break into safes. The gang, led by a man named Jimmy Hunt, welcomed him into their ranks, and it wasn't long before they were blowing up safes and stealing thousands of pounds from some of the most upscale businesses and retail shops in London. That kind of thing, it gets attention though, and the manhunt for the Jelly Gang came to an end in 1939. Chapman was first captured in Scotland and managed to escape once. His luck ran out in Jersey though, and he was arrested and thrown in jail. And this is where his life takes yet another turn. While Chapman was busy honing his skills in Britain's criminal underworld, something major was unfolding on the world stage. In June of 1940, German forces invaded the Channel Islands and set up an occupation that would last until 1945. This meant something far different for Chapman than it did for most of the British citizens living on the islands. Control of the island's prisoners was also taken over. Chapman, he was now the Germans' problem. He was released in October of 1941, and he, along with a friend that he'd made on the inside, set up a barber shop that catered mainly to the occupying German forces. This was clever because it was only a barbershop on the surface. Chapman used his newfound contacts to start buying and selling mostly stolen goods in his own small corner of the black market, but it quickly became clear that the Germans weren't as friendly as he might have hoped. Chapman was riding his bike one day when he was hit by a car. The accident turned into an interrogation by the German forces, and he was given a warning. He was to stay out of trouble, or else. The accident and subsequent questioning was a very clear indication of just how precarious his position in this German-occupied territory was, so he decided to take an extra step to secure his own safety. He wrote a letter to General Otto von Stülpnagel, offering his services in whatever capacity was needed. The Germans declined to give him a direct answer, and a few weeks later he was mysteriously arrested and sent to a prison just outside of Paris. It probably wasn't the response he was hoping for, but it wouldn't take long for him to realize that he wasn't headed for jail. Chapman was held at Fort de Romainville, and after he was first interrogated by German intelligence, they made him an offer. They would not only allow him to go free, but return him to Britain if he would agree to carry out whatever secret missions the Germans sent him. And not surprisingly, he agreed. He spent the next 3 months in training, learning espionage and spycraft. He added the use of invisible inks and wireless communications to his already lengthy skill set, and the German spy masters were so impressed with him that he quickly got his own code name and designation, Fritzchen V6523. Finally, it was go time. On a chilly night in December 1942, Chapman parachuted into Cambridge carrying a radio, a pistol, some invisible ink, some cash, and a cyanide capsule. And from there, he walked right into a local police station and turned himself in. He told the little port officers that he had been imprisoned on the Channel Islands and then had become a German spy, and in all fairness, that had to be an extremely unlikely tale. Accounts suggested that he did indeed have trouble convincing them that he was telling the truth, but this is where MI5 stepped in. Bletchley Park had already intercepted communications regarding his presence on British soil, and they saw an opportunity. So they made him another offer: work for MI5. He agreed to do that, and it was his British handlers who gave him his most infamous nickname, ZigZag. Under the watchful eye of MI5, Chapman radioed his German handler and told him all was well and that he had made it safely into British territory. The plan was to go ahead, and he was going to blow up the de Havilland aircraft factory, putting a damper on the manufacture of fast, agile new Mosquito fighter planes. MI5, of course, couldn't allow that to happen, and here's where the story crosses into territory that sounds more like something that's the responsibility of an overzealous screenwriter. They couldn't blow up the factory, but they needed to make the Germans think the mission had been a success, so well, how are they going to pull that off? First, Chapman's time with the Jelly Gang had been useful. It had given him experience with the explosive Gelignite, which MI5 made sure to requisition from a quarry in Kent. But they weren't going to blow up the whole factory. They were just going to create some smoke and mirrors and a little bit of trickery and make it look as if it had been destroyed. So the next step was to enlist the help of, believe it or not, a master magician and illusionist. His name was Jasper Maskelyne, and his role in this makes a lot of sense. At the onset of the war, Maskelyne volunteered in a place where his talents could be put to good use, the Camouflage Development and Training Center. While he was initially poo-pooed as not having any legitimate skills, he was soon transferred to A-Force, a unit specializing in deception. Among his projects were sun shields that would reflect light off tanks and make them essentially invisible from the air. He was also responsible for building a fake city of Alexandria and redirecting German bombers to a fake Suez Canal. His work was so successful, his name was added to the Gestapo's blacklist, and he soon had a bounty placed on his head. Faking the bombing and destruction of one small aircraft factory, well, that was probably going to be child's play for him. Chapman, Maskelyne, and an MI5 officer set to work. Small charges were set, and part of the factory's roof was destroyed. Maskelyne set off smoke bombs around the perimeter of the factory, scattered pieces of what looked like debris, hung tarpaulins to camouflage sections of the factory, and with the help of media coverage detailing the destruction of the factory and an enthusiastic message from Chapman to his German handlers, Germany not only bought the story hook, line, and sinker, but welcomed Chapman back into the fold. He had proved himself valuable. In 1943, MI5 sent him on his way. He hopped on a ship for Lisbon and ultimately ended up in one of the Abwehr's Norwegian safe houses. Then he was awarded the Iron Cross for his success, and MI5 still says he's the only British citizen to have been awarded the highest honor. They didn't approve of the way he spent his downtime, which mostly involved a lot of drinking and a revolving door of women. He was happy enough, but Major Michael Ryde, the MI5 agent directly in charge of keeping track of him, put it bluntly when he wrote, "The ZigZag case must be closed down at the earliest possible moment." But Chapman had other ideas, and as unlikely as it sounds, before he headed back into German territory, he volunteered for a suicide mission. The success he was believed to have had in destroying the factory gave him a certain amount of clout, and his German spy master had spoken of the distinct possibility that he would be treated to a front row seat at one of Hitler's rallies once he returned to Germany. Chapman's idea was to make good use of his knowledge of explosives and cut the head off the snake once and for all. He offered repeatedly, but every time his MI5 handlers said no. And because they were familiar with him by now, they stressed that he was not under any circumstances to try and kill Hitler. It didn't matter if he thought he could get away with it, if he was willing to die for it, he still wasn't to try. Unfortunately, all the documents that have been declassified about ZigZag and his wartime exploits don't mention just why his superiors were so adamant about keeping him from turning into an assassin. But it's been suggested by historians that there was a very real fear of reprisals, and that by this point in the war, Hitler and his erratic behavior was actually more useful alive than dead. But there's also a theory that it wasn't Chapman's idea at all, but that it had been pitched to him by the same spy master who had offered him a place in the front row of a rally. Dr. Stephan Graumann, who also went by the name von Groening, had been one of the men who oversaw Chapman's supposed conversation at Fort de Romainville, and the word on the street was that he was the one behind Chapman's bid to become immortalized in history as the one who took out Hitler. Even without that notch on his belt, Chapman did a decent job of making his own mark on history, but further word on the street is that he and Graumann were kindred spirits of a sort. Graumann was more than happy to toot Chapman's horn and sing his praises because he was reportedly skimming a bit off of Chapman's pay. Art wasn't just going to pay for itself after all, and he had an asset that he could exploit. Ultimately, Chapman's plan to assassinate Hitler was never put into motion, and he was sent to Norway. There he went through more training and, among other things, fell in love with a Norwegian woman named Dagmar Lahlum. The affair would be one of many wartime flings. It was another thing he was notorious for. During his time under the watchful eye of MI5, they got so tired of him hooking up with various ladies of the night that they gave him his own safe house. And it came complete with a former girlfriend named Freda Stevenson who would ultimately give birth to their daughter. If there was one thing that was consistent about Agent ZigZag, it was his love of the ladies, no matter which side he was currently working for. And that would change one more time in 1944 when his German handler told him that they had another job for him. Chapman was handed one more assignment from the Germans. He was to head back to Britain and find out what he could about their abilities to track German U-boats and to secure whatever technology it was that they were using in their night flights. He was also supposed to report back on how successful German bombing raids were, and after parachuting back into England in June, he and MI5 fed false information through the German intelligence network. It was thought to have a very real effect and was credited for diverting numerous attacks. The war was, of course, drawing to a close. Chapman appealed to his handlers and offered to head back to Paris, but British intelligence declined for a few reasons. First was that he was high maintenance and unpredictable, and those that worked with him seemed in decent agreement that it was time for his career as a spy to end. Secondly, MI5 already had a slew of information about Axis plans thanks to other agents and their successes in decryption. With little fanfare, Agent ZigZag was retired from the field. So what happened to Chapman after the war? Well, it didn't take long before he tried to capitalize on his adventures, writing an account of his actions in the war that he tried to serialize in a French newspaper. Unfortunately for him, this was in violation of the Official Secrets Act, and he was back in court yet again. He didn't give up, though, and published his own story in 1966. Still, the official documents remained classified until MI5 released them to the National Archive in 2001. The decades after the war were filled with enough schemes to fill a book of their own. He married Betty Farmer, the former girlfriend he had abandoned way back on the Channel Island of Jersey. They had a daughter, but he didn't settle down, and neither did she. Both carried on affairs throughout the duration of their relationship, and it was a very non-traditional one. Chapman returned to his old ways of buying and selling on the black market. He got into protection rackets and even invested in a ship that he used to further his criminal empire. He got involved in smuggling, once even being smuggled out of Tangiers himself. By the 1980s, he had slowed down just a touch and settled into running a health spa in Hertfordshire. He passed away in 1997 at 83 years old. There's a recurring theme in the opinions of those he worked with. They believed he was unpredictable, fickle, and mainly out for himself. But there's an interesting footnote to the story that suggests he was something else too. Likeable? Charming? It's difficult to say, but it is fascinating that he and his German spy master Dr. Graumann remained friends even beyond the end of the war, after the truth came out, and after all his deceptions as a double agent were made public. Still, Graumann was at the wedding when Chapman's daughter got married, and that's possibly the most incredible part of the story. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Please do smash that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. And as always, I'll see you next time.